Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with a dilemma playing out across the country, how to safely begin easing the restrictions we're all living with. Quebec and Ontario both made moves today to inch back to a new normal, even though Quebec has the most cases and the most deaths in Canada. Primary schools and daycares reopened in Quebec today, though only outside Montreal. Attendance is not mandatory and strict physical distancing rules are in place. Montreal is still shut down. It remains the epicenter of Canada's COVID-19 outbreak. Of the 85 new deaths reported in Quebec today, 82 were in the Montreal area. Premier François Legault calls the situation in that city very fragile and says he will push the planned date of reopening there beyond May 25th if necessary. The Prime Minister was asked today whether he thinks some provinces are moving too fast.
That the sacrifices we've all made for the past 2 months could all go up in smoke if we move too quickly on reopening or if a given jurisdiction makes the wrong decisions. That's why being cautious and gradual and vigilant is essential.
In Ontario, thousands of employees went back to work today. We'll get to that in just a moment, but we begin in Quebec and Mike Armstrong on how many parents were willing to send their kids back to class.
Principal Melanie Primo was on the sidewalk to welcome students back, but the buses that pulled up were almost empty. Only 3 kids on this one and only 3 on this one as well. Parents had been asked to register if their kids would be returning, so Primo says she knew what to expect and knew it wouldn't be many.
35, I would say 33 as of now, out of 170.
Those low numbers at Howick Elementary are fairly typical, according to the school board. It had 6 schools reopen Monday with about 20% attendance. Health officials have said it's safe, but even parents who did drop off their children were nervous.
You have to weigh it all. It's a personal choice, so it's hard. It's really hard to decide.
Such a beautiful classroom.
The school put out a video to reassure parents and students last week. It outlined what to expect in terms of precautions: hand sanitizer, staggered recess, physical distancing, and a new addition to the school day every 2 hours.
A bell or announcement will go over the intercom, and in intervals, everybody will wash their hands a few times through the day.
Now, attendance in some areas was higher. Quebec City saw about 2/3 of kids return. But schools in the Montreal region are still closed. They're not supposed to reopen until May 25th, and there's pushback. The city is the worst hit area in the country. Critics question whether it's too early to send kids back. The premier insists he's not rushing anything.
We still have 2 weeks in front of us, and if the situation is not getting better in the next 2 weeks, we'll postpone.
The province is going to watch the schools that reopen very closely, monitoring for COVID-19 outbreaks. But they're also going to watch how children not in school are doing and the mental health impact that might be having. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
We are tracking case numbers closely tonight as Canada approaches more pandemic milestones. The number of confirmed cases in this country is now nearly 70,000. Nearly 5,000 people have died. There are some positive signs in the numbers, though. More than 40% of those who have tested positive in Canada have recovered. And daily case numbers are trending downward in most parts of the country. A number of provinces had no new cases today, while in Ontario there were 308 new cases. That does represent a slowdown, though, over the past few weeks. And today, thousands of people in Ontario went back to work as some retail stores were allowed to reopen. Eric Sorensen explains the strategy in that province and the pitfalls that lie ahead.
Retailers across Ontario with street access have been allowed to reopen. Among them, the Common People Shop, a small general store in Toronto.
We're just really excited, honestly, to be able to see some of our regulars and see some of the new people who may have heard about our business.
They join garden centres and bigger businesses already open. Provincial and other parks have also opened ahead of schedule. All a welcome sight after 8 weeks of closures.
It's a good thing. It's showing us that all the work that we've done with social distancing is paying off, and it's good for our mental health to see that we're moving in the right direction.
The Premier hopes it's the right direction.
And with strict public health measures in place, today, thousands of people are going back to work. Thousands of people are earning a paycheck again.
Small business leaders are pleased to see more options for Canadians.
It hasn't made sense to us that we send all of our consumers to the same big box stores rather than spreading them out over the thousands of tiny companies that are lucky to see maybe 10 or 20 customers in a day.
Still, the economic lockdown required unprecedented government spending. Ontario's Financial Accountability Office forecasts the provincial deficit will grow from about $10 billion to $41 billion for the next year, and reopening only gradually could see the deficit deepen further.
Even more fiscal stimulus will be required. So even with the big numbers that we have today, I suspect that we still aren't done hearing about new programs to help stimulate a recovery.
Meantime, there is a steady improvement in the COVID-19 picture in Ontario. There's a lag time in counting, but Monday's 308 new cases shows a promising trend of declining numbers in the province. Health officials point out that a long-term lockdown wouldn't be healthy either.
We need to get life starting to go back to normal, but obviously this is going to result in some increase in the number of cases, and we have to be ready for that. But it's important to note that that is expected.
Restrictions are being eased, but it's also clear the economy is not stampeding towards business as usual. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Even when the curve completely flattens, it doesn't mean the virus has vanished. So returning to work and school will require constant vigilance. If there's an outbreak, it will have to be contained immediately. And that means tracing all the people anyone who tests positive has come into contact with. Companies are busy deploying a wide range of technologies and protective measures to help keep their staff and customers safe. But at what cost? Jeff Semple reports.
For the first time in weeks, this Toronto business is back in bloom. Ontario garden centres are now allowed to open their doors to the public, but when employees arrived, they barely recognized it.
It is extraordinarily different.
Besides keeping their distance, staff are required to wear protective equipment. And some companies are even adding surveillance. This auto plant opened its doors to workers for the first time in nearly 2 months. They're now scanned by thermal imaging cameras, taking their temperature before they're allowed in.
Even in the break areas, we've provided separation and barriers.
But what if an employee tests positive for COVID-19? Turns out there's an app for that. Private companies and governments in more than 25 countries have now deployed these contact tracing smartphone apps. They use a phone's GPS to track a person's location. So for example, if a coworker were to test positive for COVID-19, the company could retrace their steps and alert anyone who they might have had contact with.
It's important to kind of note that all of this remains anonymous.
This Vancouver app developer says his software also helps companies enforce physical distancing.
Let's say, for example, best practices is you're only allowed to have one person in a truck at a time on a construction site. And we sense that there are 2 people in the truck. We might send a notification.
But these location tracking COVID-19 apps are raising alarm bells.
If you start collecting geolocation data, you're going to lose a lot of faith in this and trust, because that can then be linked to personal identifiers.
Ontario's former privacy commissioner notes that Apple and Google are teaming up on a solution to support contact tracing with Bluetooth technology instead of GPS to better protect personal data. But while governments must persuade their citizens to use the software, employers don't need to ask.
Employers are allowed to know where their employees are and what their employees are doing because the employer is the one paying for the employee's time.
Health experts say these protective measures, including contact tracing, are critical if the country is to avoid a second wave and turn over a new leaf. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
The new series that goes inside the COVID-19 pandemic, from the front lines to the everyday heroes helping us cope with the unprecedented change. Coronavirus, the new reality. A Global News special, Sundays at 7 on Global.